was still a pretty young developer. And then after that, I used my skills at AngularJS to get another job, and then came to transition time to Angular 2, and that was like TypeScript and classes, and it was a whole nother language. And so then at that point, I was senior enough to start making decisions. I said, I don't really like this, let's check something else out. We jumped on Vue, and I've basically been doing Vue ever since and dabbling in other stuff just for fun. So I love all this kind of stuff. I spend most of my free time building silly things in JavaScript and that kind of stuff. Nothing too crazy, but anyway, that's kind of my credentials and where I'm coming from. So I'm curious where we're at. There's, 6 of us. How many of us are web developers? All of us? Okay, yeah. And I don't know how to do it, but say how many people would consider yourself like senior level web developer? Okay, and mid-level? Just starting out? All right, so we got like everything. And then in terms of frameworks, I think it's kind of funny to define yourself as like a Vue developer or an Angular developer, but we're going to do it for the purpose of just me figuring out our experience. So I don't know, do we have any Vue developers here? All right, a little bit. Svelte? Cool. Angular? A little bit. And React? It's the big one? Okay, cool. I am a complete noob at React. I've got like some stuff up here and it kind of scared me. Razor? yeah. PHP, Blade. Sorry, I'm JavaScript, so anything outside of that, I'm like, I don't know. Blazor? No. Cool. Well, that's cool to see. So we got a pretty good mix of everything. But yeah, we'll just get into it then. So the reason I wanted to talk on this today is someone at a frameworks presentation, I don't think it was anyone here, gave a talk all about Svelte, and they did a fantastic job. But it was kind of comparing. That was Brian. Okay. Yeah, and they kind of gave it in context of comparing it to Vue, and I kind of felt like my precious Vue was being stepped on a bit, which it was fine. But I just wanted to give Vue a fair shake. But then as I was doing that, I kind of wanted to figure out a way to kind of make it a more holistic discussion. So we're going to compare modern frameworks to a sort of modern take on vanilla JS, and I guess see what we can learn from it. It should be fun. So leading off with the question, why do we do JavaScript frameworks? They're kind of insane nowadays. Like if you compare like old school HTML, you just create an HTML page, you throw it up on the website, it works. Maybe you add a little spice with JavaScript, and you have buttons and things like that. And if we look at it, vanilla JS is almost always faster if you're looking at benchmarks. The frameworks always have bundling and stuff you don't need. It's kind of the nature of a framework. They're trying to appeal to a mass market and do all these different features. And so it's going to come with stuff that you're not going to use, but someone else is going to use. And we do some stuff like tree shaking and that kind of thing to try to mitigate that, but it is what it is. It's always going to be bigger than a vanilla solution. And security, almost every modern framework has this sort of tool chain of like 600, 700 dependencies. And if any one of those gets compromised, you're running compromised code on your laptop. Your clients could be running compromised code on their computers. Your servers could be running compromised codes when they build code when it builds. It could be bad, but we still do it to ourselves. We still are very dedicated to the framework world. That you almost can't. I don't think there's a single major product out there that's built that doesn't use React, Svelte, Vue, or whatever, right? So I thought about this a bit, and I think it really comes down to just this: the developer experience, because in the end, if we want to deliver like the perfect product to the end user, we're going to be doing it in vanilla. But it sucks. Like it's not very well. It's not easy to maintain. You're going to be using code that some dude made 10 years ago, trying to figure out what he was thinking when he did this, all that kind of stuff. So we use these for the developer experience, and the trade-off is not too bad. You get a slightly bigger bundle size, slightly longer render time. But if you're not like, I don't know, doing machine learning computation in a canvas or something like that, it doesn't really matter, right? And then you get these other benefits where, every modern framework uses the component pattern. Well, in normal HTML or jQuery, you could do whatever the heck you want with components and elements and put it all over the page and read things from the page and use the page as your state. One of my favorite things in my first job as a programmer, it was a very jQuery focused site, and on the checkout page, we computed the cost, we put that cost on the page, and then we read from the element and gave that number to the server for our cost, which meant that you could go in there and you could edit it to 0 and then submit it. And then if the cost was 0, it didn't even ask for like any information beyond an address. So they couldn't even track down who did it. So that's kind of like this horrible jQuery mess where you're depending so much on the DOM, you make silly mistakes like that. Now I was kind of almost all like part-time programmer intern people doing that, so it happens. But anyway, it protects you a little bit from that kind of thing. It does all the heavy lifting, right? So like in this example, if you want to put some text on a page, you put a sentence and a username in the middle of it, and you're trying to update that username in JavaScript, or any variable really, a framework will usually grab that variable and maybe even treat it as a separate text node, and it can just reach in and change that text node when the value changes. And that's an extremely cheap operation. Whereas if you're doing it in vanilla, you're probably going to, at the bare minimum, you're going to be grabbing the whole element and then maybe doing like some template interpolation to swap out your variables, on a given event or something like that. So it does, just these things that are very complicated in vanilla, makes them super, super easy, right? That's why we use them. And then also, if you're not using a framework, you're bringing your own framework. Either that or you're going to have this horrible mess that no one can use in a year or two, right? That all being said, let's head to the year 2010. We've got the founders of AngularJS, Backbone.js on an airplane. Boom, they all died. No framework, sorry. It's this jQuery vanilla JS hellscape. What's that going to look like, right? So I've built out this music player app. Doesn't actually play music, it lists songs. This is all in vanilla JS. Nothing too crazy, whatever, bunch of tables. We're going to switch to the code and check it out. So, going to zoom. There it goes.
We got pepperoni sausage and cheese pizza ready to go.
All right. Should we pause and grab pizza?
Let's do it.
Okay. Don't want to get cold. We all have varying degrees in experience, but I guess the one sort of common thread through all modern applications is the component tree pattern. You've got components, you pass data in, components emit events out, and that way we're able to keep data and state kind of clean, so we know who's changing what, where it's being changed. We don't have stuff kind of changing all over the place. So we're trying to follow that pattern here in vanilla land. Oh, I should also clarify that the event of the airplane crashing was a fictional circumstance. I think they're all alive and well. Okay, so let me zoom in one more time.
So I think a lot of the framework, the creation of frameworks was for the lack of the ES JavaScript, but there's this interesting arc where there was a long neglect of JavaScript, a long amount of time where there was no enhancements for JavaScript.
Right.
So frameworks are trying to spackle in on these and trying to make things nice. And now there's an annual update to JavaScript, ECMAScript now, which they're like coming together where it's whittling away, eating away at some of the framework stuff because it's documented to what we want is to have all the power of a framework in vanilla. We wouldn't have the extra overhead, right?
Yeah. It'd be great because we already have these browsers sitting there eating 300 megabytes of storage. We don't need everything else on top. So yeah, and I think this should illustrate how close we're getting, and hopefully illustrate some gaps that we still need filled. But really, with just a couple things, maybe we could throw away our frameworks. I don't know. Can everyone see that okay? Okay. Let's see, where are we starting? So just some context, this is being hosted by Vite, and we're using Tailwind, CSS framework, but it makes my life easier. And so it's not quite vanilla, I guess, but whatever. So with Vite and Tailwind, that all works great. We're vanilla, we don't need Vue, we don't need whatever to make that work. All right, we're off to the races. First of all, this looks pretty normal. We've got just some setup. We're doing lots of flex stuff to make it all do that. That's maybe my crutch, I don't know. And then first thing that's kind of interesting is this guy right here that I'm covering up. This is an anchor tag, but we have this fun attribute here, is. And so this is an extended anchor tag. We're using all of the default behavior of the anchor, and then we're slapping some behavior on top of it, and we're indicating that to the browser with that attribute. That's all native, and so we can take a look at that implementation. One of them. Okay, so we're using the native Web Components API, which is confusingly called the custom elements object in JavaScript. So if we talk about web components, we use custom elements. It has this nice little define thing here. We tell it our element name. The element name always needs a dash, and that's to distinguish it from native elements. A native element will never have a dash. Then we create a class. That class is going to extend our friend the HTML anchor element, which gives us all nice things like right-click, middle-click, the little hover down at the bottom left corner that tells you where you're going, all that kind of stuff. We don't have to implement that. We can just use it from the browser. One of the things I think is interesting about this is that the browser requires us to extend here, and then way down at the bottom, we got to tell it, hey, we're extending, and then back on that other page, we say, by the way, this is a page link. It's kind of a really confusing thing to do, but I like it because we can just so easily slap behavior on top of existing stuff, right? Like there's no way to emulate an anchor behavior, especially with the little hover that comes out the bottom left, using pure JavaScript. You have to extend an anchor. Normally that looks like, you take an anchor tag and you stick it inside of like a Vue or a React component, right? But we can just use an anchor tag. Come back up. So Tailwind usually recommends, I don't know how many people are familiar with Tailwind, but it's these sort of utility classes that can go on forever. And the temptation as a person who doesn't use Tailwind is to use their little apply tag and create these classes, do apply, list them out, boom, you've got a class, whatever, use that class instead. Tailwind recommends avoiding doing that because that means you're doing CSS again, yada, yada. They recommend creating components and then putting your class in the component, right? So then every time we use this component, we get something that uses that class, and we don't have to write CSS. So we can emulate that behavior with web components just fine. Now we have another sort of interesting name. There's the connected callback. The connected callback is like mounted component did mount use effect, if I'm understanding that correctly. It'll run as soon as the component, or just after the component has been placed into the DOM. And every element actually has a connected property, which you can read that'll tell you if it's in the DOM or not. Even boring old div has a connected property. I actually had to use that just recently for a feature and something else unrelated. So what we're doing is our behavior we're adding is we're going to, on connection, we're going to check if our anchor tag represents the current page, or the active page, right? And then we're going to add a pop state listener, which is the event that fires when we use history push state. And we change the URL without actually changing the page, right? Because that results in a white flash. It means we have to load our assets again, all that jazz. So Then just here we're checking, so we're going to compare the window location href to the href of the anchor that we pass into it just like normal. So far so good. We're going to give it a class if it is and another class if it's not. Yeah, we're actually removing it if it's not. Great. So that's our component, and all this is native JavaScript besides Tailwind, but you could do that with vanilla classes too if you wanted to. But this kind of thing, I think this kind of thing right here, like this, I think is valid in really any context. Like you could make a cool little anchor tag and use it natively in any framework except React, because React doesn't like web components. So you have to wrap it. But I think this kind of thing where you're just sort of encapsulating existing behavior and slapping a little bit on top is a great way to program, and I really want to explore it some more. But getting back out of here, so that is our links on our page. Normally, I guess this would be the replacement for router link or whatever it is in the associated framework. Then we're going to have a router view or an outlet, and this is where our router that I'll show you in a second is going to swap out content when you click the link and use JavaScript to just stick a new element there, right? So let's go there. Make sure I get the right one. So here's some more stuff. This should look familiar to anyone who's written a router in any other framework. We are going to define our pages as components. These pages are going to define some more custom elements. We'll look at one of them. And then the page itself is just exporting element name. So in this case, it's just exporting the string songs page. So then we have the sort of guts of this thing. We're going to define some routes. Say if you're going to that route, we're going to load that component. And this is where we actually do that, where we're going to compare those paths. And then here, we get the magic happening, where we're going to read the element, which is just a string. We're going to just do a normal create element on it, and then we're going to grab that router view component you saw, which is just a name. There's nothing really happening there, and we're going to replace it with our newly made component here. And then some nonsense there, just because I was lazy with that class name stuff. This is just what a router would do in React or in Vue or in any other framework. It's going to render or grab like the function that represents a component in Vue, and it's going to run that function. It's going to then chunk that into the DOM, but it's going to do it in its special way or whatever. But at the end of the day, this is basically what it's doing. And then we're going to drive all this with this fancy new API that Firefox doesn't support yet, or Safari, called the Navigation API. And the Navigation API just lets you natively intercept a navigation event coming from an anchor, and then you can run whatever the heck you want in its place. It's really neat, and it makes it so that, again, I think Vue router is like 9 kilobytes or something like that, right? Well, that's like 10 lines of code. So in theory, maybe in a year, we should be able to swap that out once Firefox adopts it. And I think they've signaled that they want to, but they're just a little hesitant because this is all riding on the top of the history API, which is a little flaky. So anyway, hopefully they get that worked out, and we can just use this because this is great for even just doing simpler vanilla websites. So.
When was the last time you looked at Safari? Because they've been doing aggressively bringing it up to speed. A lot of new enhancements with Safari.
Yeah. So I checked this specific API last night. But I think they have signaled that they're interested in it. But it just takes time. So, all right. So that's our router. Now let's take a look at what a sort of more robust component looks like than our page link. So here's where we're setting up. We're just exporting that string name, which represents the custom element that we've defined. And then here we're defining it by that name, just kind of trying to keep it all simple so we're not repeating ourselves. We're just extending a boring old HTML element. I probably could have extended a div or something like that, but I wanted the sort of name behavior. I didn't want it to do is this or whatever. All right, so same kind of deal here. We've got a constructor. Okay, constructor's doing nothing. And then we've got this render function, which I've just named render. You don't have to name it render. You can name it Bob's your uncle. And then we are writing HTML here. And then I've got a little editor extension that says, if you see this, treat this as HTML. This is actually one of the sort of weakest spots, I feel like, in this kind of thing, where if you want to write like what's the word, highlighted HTML, the best way to do that is to write a separate file and then import that in with like a raw loader or something like that. This does the job. It just, you don't get very good class highlighting, you don't get very good a lot of other stuff, and I'm doing like interpolation on top of it, trying to keep the trying to use these names kind of like you would a component in a framework, right? But that's what this is doing. We're grabbing table page from that other component. We'll take a look at that in a sec. That's the most complicated piece of this app. And then doing some stuff here with slots, where again we've imported that from it. I don't know if that's necessary. I thought it was kind of a fun idea where you could have like a component define its own slots and use them. But that's our HTML. We're taking advantage of a slot that this table page has defined, and a slot is just where you tell a component that when I stick something inside of you, you can define what to do with that something inside of the sort of consuming component there. We'll look at that in a sec. Slots are a concept common to all frameworks. Again, we have our connected callback, and we're rendering, and then here we're going to get some data. So we're going to get our reference to that table page component, and then we are going to set some headers for it. If you've used Vuetify, this should look familiar. Most data tables are similar concepts. And then we're going to set the headers property on that element. This is just an HTML element reference. But inside of that element, we've set up a setter so that it's going to do some special behavior when we assign that specific thing. It's kind of like a prop, but not as good. Then this is just a pub sub store. We're subscribing to it here. Anytime this songs attribute gets updated, we're going to then define the items on the page. So that gives us some reactivity, right? If this were some sort of system where someone could add a song, this would then trigger, and then we'd pass that data into the table page again for it to do stuff with it. And then I think that's the most exciting bit. We're going to unsubscribe from our pub sub if we get disconnected from the DOM. What's interesting about this isn't that different than what a Svelte store looks like. So it's kind of cool that it's very aligned there. All right, now we'll get to the fun bits, and this is kind of where, like, so far it doesn't feel too bad. Like, it's like, yeah, we're writing components, we're consuming them, we're writing a router. Like, it kind of feels like a modern framework. This is kind of where it falls apart. All right, so number one, we are entering the realm of the shadow DOM. So that means we got to do some hacky stuff. If you're not familiar with it, the shadow DOM is something you could attach to actually any element. Doesn't have to be a custom element. But the shadow DOM is creatively named isolated area of DOM. So if you have a whole bunch of class names and selectors that define a bunch of different things for divs and inputs and selects, anything inside the shadow DOM will be shaded or protected from those CSS selectors, except inherited properties. So if you define any sort of properties that are inherited by default, those are going to sneak their way in. I don't know why they did that, but they did. And so you can do like an all unset property to get rid of it. But here is just a fun little thing. I'm using Tailwind. Tailwind defines CSS style sheet outside of the shadow DOM. And so I'm using this file to go and find that style sheet and then stick it into the shadow DOM. So we're getting rid of all that isolation so I can use Tailwind classes. I don't think it'd be good to do this in production, but we're doing it here. Okay, so moving on. All right, so here we are attaching the shadow. When you attach a shadow, it creates a shadow root on an element. This shadow root you can treat like a normal element. So here we're just passing into this render function so that this render function can interact with it like an element. Just everything that's inside that will end up in the shadow DOM, be safe from CSS. Cool. Now, the main reason I'm doing it here, and I actually wish that I didn't have to, is because of this slot. Now, in this particular case, we don't really need a slot for an H1, but if we wanted to stick like a button or something like that in there from the page that's using this, we need a slot, right? So come back here. So here's that default slot, and I could put whatever I want here. See, I don't get auto-completion because of this silly literal thing. Yeah, it's horrible. Oh, I spelled it wrong. But anyway, using a slot gives us that flexibility, right? In order to use a slot in web component world, you got to use Shadow DOM. I wish that wasn't the case because Shadow DOM comes with the sort of awkwardness with like the parent stuff and some awkwardness in querying, a few other things, but that's how it is. So we've got that slot in there. We're setting up this scaffold for a table, and then we've got this function that's going to add our table. And this is the first sort of real pain point when it comes to doing vanilla is list iteration or rendering a list. I'm doing it in the worst way possible, where I'm saying, you're handing me a new list, great, blow away the old DOM, render out a new DOM. Most frameworks are going to use a list, set up a bunch of keys on it, and then they'll say, did this element change? No? Okay, we'll leave it alone. Did this element change? Oh, yes, let's go change this specific bit of text inside this part of this element. It's very cheap, and in that way you can render out hundreds and hundreds of elements, and it usually is okay as long as you're not doing anything crazy. We can write that algorithm to do that, and I have in another project, but it's just something you got to do on a case-by-case basis because we decided not to use a framework. And it's actually a good point to point out as well, what I mentioned before, where if you want to do something similar, just stick text on the page, we can kind of do that, but it means that we're doing something like inner HTML or text content, right? And it's not the prettiest thing, and updating it means we got to keep track of exactly where we put it, and then we got to change it and update it again.
Have you used this at large scale?
No, and I wouldn't recommend it really, but it's fun. I like it.
I know, like coders using React. They actually use the limitations of React. And they actually stopped using React, and I think they went to Node.js because it was so large.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I feel like they probably could have made it work, but I don't know. Hard to say without seeing their stuff. But yeah, I mean, that's something. A lot of what you gain in speed, you have to make up for in memory, and so maybe that's the kind of thing that they're running into with the framework. But interesting. I'd love to see their solution. Okay, so then here's where we kind of set up the equivalent of props. So this is our equivalent of a headers prop. You saw in the other place we were assigning to it. It's just a simple setter. So we're saying when you assign to the headers property, run this function. And then because the headers and the items are kind of dependent on each other, we're doing some checks. And then, yeah, we're storing it on the instance. We're returning it for a getter. Nothing too exciting. And then here we have, if you set the items, then we're going to render out the rows inside of the table. Now, what's interesting here, and this is something I didn't know until I did this project, is in Vue, and I'll show you an example. We're talking about slots. Vue has this interesting thing called dynamic slots or dynamically named slots, where when you're rendering out a list, you can name something like, I don't know, TD colors or something like that. And then when you're consuming that, you can say, template slot equals TD colors, and then for every instance of that slot in the list, it will be populated with what you passed it. And it's kind of hard to visualize, I'm sure, but I'll show you. That's actually unique to Vue as far as I can tell. And so what I'm doing here with these extended TRs and extended THs is trying to emulate that by creating a specific component for this use case so I get the behavior that I want where I want it, basically. So it's kind of an awkward workaround, again, for something that a framework usually provides for free. So, but that's about it in terms of the vanilla implementation. And so, like, I don't know, all in all, we give it like a 6 out of 10, 7 out of 10. Like, it's super fun to do, but I feel like as soon as you started to scale it up, you'd need to do something like write some sort of list renderer. You need to figure out a way to write some sort of easy interpolation updater, that kind of thing. And a lot of those things, like if you're rendering out a list of like 20 items, the user won't be able to tell that you just blew away the list and you replaced it. Like, they never would. Even if you did that in like 6 locations on the page, they're not going to be able to tell. It's going to feel nice to them, right? But if you ever needed to, then you're faced with not just implementing your feature, you have to implement the sort of boilerplate that builds the feature. So, with all that being said, if you like this, I guess before we move on too far, do you have any questions about that sort of vanilla land implementation?
I would call it a bespoke implementation versus a framework, right?
Yeah.
Vanilla, to me, there are needs for this, and it's something that is just so unique that's why we would call it bespoke. But for so many typical web implementations, there's not a bespoke need.
Yeah.
The technical backend. Usually the client's like, make something that's functional and looks nice.
Right.
It doesn't have to be bespoke. But I've had a client once that actually was like, I need to compete against my competitor, and I want something that's going to whiz bang the community, and I don't want anything which is going to look like anybody else's website. So it's like, oh great. So we can't use tools because they look like other people's tools. Especially when, like, for CSS frameworks.
Yeah. That's probably the major pain point there is the CSS framework then. I bundled this project. I bundled a Vue project and a Svelte project, and this one netted about 24 kilobytes total. The Svelte project is like 47, and then the Vue project was 94. So this is the smallest, and so even in just that scenario where if you had a very low space requirement, maybe you're doing something like IoT and you're doing JavaScript on IoT for some reason, this could be a good option for that. It's about as small as you can get. But if you liked that kind of vibe, there's a lovely library out there called Lit Element, and they have Lit HTML, and it looks very similar, just a lot cleaner, and they handle things like variable interpolation and list rendering and registration of your components and all that kind of thing, and it's much more closer to being a framework because it is a framework. But you're also building out these native web elements, and the browser's handling a lot of that instead of JavaScript. So there's pros and cons to it. And like I said, it was a lot of fun to do that, and I actually think that with this music player thing, I'm actually building that for my own private network. I want something I can listen to like Pandora, right? I think I might actually finish it off in that style just for fun. But yeah, I wouldn't try to propose that to my tech lead at work as a new alternative or whatever. So with that as a sort of backdrop, let's look at Vue. Yep. Vue, we're now on to Vue 3. It's an iteration on Vue 2. And although it provides some options that keep it similar to Vue 2 if you're so inclined, I would recommend using it in the sort of modern way, which is this setup script thing. The setup script is a bundler boilerplate that says, do a whole bunch of stuff to what you've put in here to make magical things happen. And that's kind of the theme for Vue 3 is, a lot of magic, but it's really nice to use magic. But if you ever had to debug the setup script not being bundled correctly or something like that, you're up a creek. Not that I've ever run into that, but you know, it's something to consider.
So it's prevention of configuration.
Yeah. Yep. So they've abstracted away, because the configuration, if you tried to bootstrap this yourself or whatever and set up the roll-up or the Webpack and whatever, it'd be a nightmare. And so they've abstracted all that away, and you just get this nice stuff. Now, something I do want to mention is with the web components implementation, a properly done web component is going to be in browser memory, and when the browser sees that tag, it's going to render it out like browsers do. With Vue and React and Svelte, to some degree, this is actually a JavaScript function. This whole thing is a JavaScript function. I think it's important to remember that. This is read by your bundler and turned into a render function. In React, it's really easy to remember that because you're literally writing functions. But if we look at the pieces of this, it's not too different from our web components project. We've got a sidebar, we've got all this flux again. I actually just copied and pasted mostly. And then here we have a page link, which is wrapping a router link, which is a Vue specific thing. But pretty similar, we even have a router view, except in this case that is an actual Vue component that is dictating some behavior. All right, and then here's that router. Same kind of deal. We're going to import our songs. In this case, we also have to import some functions that are used to tell the router how to behave, because again, it's a framework and it's got a whole bunch of stuff for a whole bunch of people, and we're just going to use a part of it. And we're going to do that here. I think there's also like create hash history if you want to use the old school hash routing. Okay, and then here's an example of, I showed you the songs page in their project. This is the albums page. In this project, very similar, but I wanted to use it to show off the name slots. So we'll look at that in a sec. Here we're pulling in our music store. In Vue, we use composables very often. A composable is a function that you want to run often in a setup thing. So in a setup script, we can define variables that we can use in our template. And if we found ourselves defining the same variables and the same behavior, the same functions that we want to run in the template, we can bundle all that up in a composable, and then we can import that and consume it across a wide array of components. It's a replacement for Mixin's feature of Vue 2, basically, and it's a lot nicer to use. Actually, today in my job, I wrote a composable that let us generate unique IDs. You pass in a bunch of strings, you get an object back with those strings attached to unique IDs. That's the kind of idea. What's that?
You got a comment there. It says if going non-Pina.
Yep. So Pina is the default de facto store for Vue 3 and Vue 2 actually. But I wanted to show that using Vue's built-in ref system, you don't need Pina, although it does provide some conveniences. All right, so here we're going to define our album. We've got our get function to get the albums. We're going to run that function, and then we're going to insert those things into the template. Now, what's interesting with Vue, and it's something that it's kind of hard to wrap your head around. This is a real simple instance of it. Is we're not like awaiting that. We're just saying get albums because everything is reactive. So as soon as albums gets updated, it's going to change there. And I know that's a common thing in frameworks, but this can be extended out to get albums could return like a loading state and is loaded state, an error state, and the data. And then we can react to all of that without ever having to do like async await, because we can just rely on the framework to update when something changes. And it's, I feel like, a really powerful way of thinking about your data, but it also is a little funny to wrap your head around coming from like a very imperative approach if you're in any other framework, really. Okay, and then if you've never used Vue before, what's going on here is just data binding. That colon syntax, the colon is actually valid HTML attribute syntax, but in this case, it is telling the Vue compiler to do its magic and bind this to that and allow the table page component to react to it. And then here we have these templates. Again, this is a feature that's a little bit unique to Vue. Templates let us define where content goes inside of another component, but do so in a potentially transparent way. So in web component land and in Svelte, unless Svelte has fragments, I don't know if it does, but you normally have to define like a span and then attach your slot name to that, and then that whole span gets plumped into the component that is being created. In this case, we're just telling Vue to grab this string and put it in this slot, and that's it. We don't have to create extra elements to do that. And then here we have this concept of dynamically named slots. So this TD is actually, there's going to be one of it on this list. There could potentially be many, but for every matching slot, it'll run this function essentially, or do whatever I say to do here. That's really powerful for things like data tables, because it means that if I want to, I could put like a delete button on every cell there, right? And I don't have to do anything special to get it there. It's just using HTML. It's one of those things that, again, is kind of, I don't know, maybe tricky to wrap your head around sometimes, but once you've got it, it's very, very powerful. Okay. And here's our store. So I wanted to show this off. This is Vue. Everything in Vue is based on this concept of this ref, or it also has like a ref for objects called reactive. A ref wraps data in an object, and you access the actual data you care about with the value attribute. So you can see that here, this value attribute. The rest of this is actually a JavaScript proxy, and it's running a bunch of setters and getters every time you access or change the value in order to go and update the rest of all the component tree that is consuming this ref. And so in this case, we can define this ref in its own file apart from any component, and then use this composable to return that ref and the attendant functions that update it, and any component that consumes that will get updated when it gets updated. Vue does provide a thing called Pinya, which I would recommend using, but using Pinya is basically the same. You just, instead of this being a bare function, you say define store, I think, and then you wrap that around that function, and so you're returning the result of that. And Pinya just does some nice things to make it a little easier to use. It does things like lets you take snapshots, go forward and backwards with state changes and stuff like that. But I wanted to show off just how cool refs are, because again, it's something that I don't think any other language really has, except for Preact now has something called signals, which basically copies refs, which is great. Anyway, so that's our store. And then here's our table page, which is, again, very complicated. I'm going to pop over to VS Code. All right. So in Vue land, when do you want props? You know, we pass in the items, the headers, and then I didn't end up using this prop. You use this define prop function. That is a lie. It's not a function. It's telling the bundler to do a bunch of magic stuff with it. But this is just saying, you know, we're going to pass in some items, we're going to pass in some headers, they're going to be arrays, and if they don't get anything, that's what they're going to be. And so then we create our template. We're going to use a slot from this component, and we're going to define another slot, just passing headers down. And then we've got our list rendering. So instead of that for loop and blowing stuff away like we did in the web component, we just can say v4. In Svelte, that's bracket each. In React, that's map, usually. And we're going to define a header, an index of the headers. There's the key. The key allows the framework to go and find the component that needs to be updated and update just that component. And it's a little more efficient that way. And then we can use some special syntax from Vue to set classes based on context, right? So I'm just rounding and changing things based on, you know, which TD is first and last. But we can do all that with this nice little class helper instead of doing if-else statements. Let's see. Same deal here, but here is where we're going to define that dynamic slot. So that header value we define back on the albums page, which we looked at. So that value is here. It's going to be name, artist, songs, or length. And here you can see we're saying we're going to define TD, name, artist, value, length, so that the component that's using this can then pass content into those spots. And like I said, as far as I can tell, that's a unique to Vue feature. Svelte will actually yell at you explicitly if you try to do that. I don't know where React is more about passing components themselves into the function, so it's a little different. So yeah, so that's a kind of high-level Vue component. Do we have any questions about that? Whole lot of stuff.
How do you get that? So the state that you're getting from the endpoint or whatever, how are you getting it into the table? So how do you get the actual data? So you're using it to you run the albums to actually get the data. How do you map it in?
Oh, sure. Yep, that's yeah. So we have Git albums. We've got albums, which we're grabbing from the store. And then here we have the items prop on the tables page, which is getting the albums.
So when you actually get the albums, you don't need to reference value like you did in the store. You just get the album.
Yeah, and this is maybe is like the stickiest part of Vue. If you're in script land and you want to update albums, you shouldn't since it's a store value, but you have to reference value. That's bad since it's a store, but you could define a let thing equals ref 0, and then thing.value is how you change the value of it, but then in the template you use it as thing. So that's probably like the most fiddly thing to do with Vue. So I'm glad you called it out. Okay.
I use Vue 2 and it's like so much easier.
Oh yeah.
Than Vue 2. Using Vue 3 is very
Oh yeah, yeah. I recently switched myself. Yeah, I love it. Like the ref thing and the stores and all that kind of stuff compared to almost any other framework. So easy to work with. Cool. Well, there's no other question of that. I thought we'd run through some comparisons with all the frameworks. Well, 3 of them, kind of, sort of. I was writing all this out and I got to React and I was out of brain power and time. So I kind of have some loose approximations. So we've got our Vue router, which we looked at. This is the Svelte router. It's very similar. It's kind of interesting is that all the frameworks are kind of coming together, which is nice. So nothing too crazy there. What is interesting with Svelte is in SPA mode, a single page app mode, I don't think there's a de facto router. So like with Vue, there's Vue router. With Svelte, there were like 3 options, and none of them seem particularly good. Is that accurate?
So with Svelte, when it went 1.0, it was like ripping like duct tape off of your arm to switch to the new way they do it with the layouts page and error files. Once you've gotten all the way into that freezing cold water, it's fantastic. But yeah, there is no router. It's essentially defined by a folder structure, and in each folder you have a layout and a page. And it's kind of almost works like a slot where the layout loads and the page gets loaded into it. But it's nice because it's kind of like, you ever use Nuxt?
Yeah.
It's kind of like that. If you use Nuxt for you just put stuff in the right place and it just happens. So
Cool. Is that using SvelteKit then? Okay. Okay.
But I like it because you have doing it anyway, take the plus font names. Everything has to be plus layout or plus page. So it's kind of annoying to actually type it all out or select the file from your terminal because your terminal hates the plus.
Oh yeah.
But once you have it done, it's very convenient.
Yeah, and it's similar to Next and Nuxt if you're in that space anyway. So nothing too crazy there then. So yeah. Then please correct me if I'm wrong. This is like the best thing I could find. I've never written a React router, and I ran out of time to actually do it. Does that look right? Because it's kind of cool if it is. Yeah? Okay. I actually kind of like it because you're defining the routes and stuff in the template space. And then I did see some examples where you could like build out the same similar sort of routes page. But okay, we got our view store, which we looked at. And the Svelte store, pretty similar, right? We've got our get songs, get albums, get playlist, get songs, get albums, get playlist. We've got a writable piece here, which is kind of doing similar things to ref. And we do .set on it. And then here's implementation. You know, pretend we're in song Svelte. We get a song list, define it to an empty array. Then we're going to subscribe to the songs. And whenever songs changes, we're going to update songs list. And then we're going to go and get the songs. What's interesting, I thought, with that is that it looked like you kind of always have to use two variables. Does that seem accurate to any Svelte users? Yeah. So it's a little awkward there, and not all dissimilar from the vanilla approach. And then yeah, here's Redux. And I actually did write this out. Redux is intimidating. I don't know if you've ever, yeah. Yeah, I've done MobX, which felt a lot better. But which one?
Context.
Mm-mm.
Context to the React topic. You can provide context to anything you use it.
Oh. Okay.
So if you put it like the app, the top level of the app, and if you don't use the
Gotcha.
I don't use Redux.
Okay.
Large scale projects, yes. Context for small.
I don't even know for large. Like there's so much going on with it. Like there's like you've got this actions thing going on. I think I'm exporting like a reducer or something, and then and then the docs pretty sure told me to import one thing, and then I went to another page and told me to import something else. So it's a confusing experience, interesting, and I kind of get the sense that the React world wants to move away and on from it. So. All right, view component, looked at that. Songs component, getting our songs, put them in the template. Svelte component, very similar. We've got this songs list, we're subscribing, getting our songs, getting our headers, and then you put them in with this bracket interpolation that should be familiar to anyone who's comfy with React. Although I don't know if React allows you to do this kind of thing, where this is kind of like when you're doing an object and you can define the property and the key at the same time by just using the property variable name. But you can in React. Cool. You can't in Vue. They explicitly don't allow it because it represents a Boolean in Evan Vue's mind. Okay, and then React component. Kind of same deal. We're getting our variable. We're dispatching, getting the songs, getting the headers, and binding them, which I guess I could have done that same syntax there. But yeah. Yeah, that's my presentation.
You reached the end of your slides?
I did. Did I reach them early?
Usually, I recommend thank you slide at the end so we can actually clap. So this is the end of your slide, right?
Yep.
End of your presentation. Thank
That's
you
all I
very
got. All right.